So my grandma had this thing for napkins. She would sit at the edge of her bed and start opening up the 250 count pack of napkins that we'd get her at the dollar store. She'd take out a stack about this thick, and then she'd start turning 90 degrees. And so at this point, for some context, my grandmother could pretty much only walk the short distances with her walker, and when she was sitting down, she could only really extend her arms as far as back and forward as she can go. So this little lady would turn around, start taking the stack with her, and going as far back as she could extend her arm, just to place this one stack of napkins by the head of her bed right next to her pillow. And when she would turn back around, she would more often than not find herself looking straight at me with 100,000 questions written all over my face. The main question wasn't the one that you're probably asking yourself right now, which is, where is this going? I knew that. I knew that she was going to go and stick her hand right back in the napkins, that the crinkle of the plastic is what I was going to hear, that she was going to take out another stack, and that she was going to place it somewhere else. And that for a few minutes, this is what I was going to hear. It was going to be crinkle and stack and crinkle and stack and crinkle and stack. What I was asking myself was if my mom was up in heaven staring at me, judging me for how much I ended up resenting napkins and this habit my grandmother had, or if she was staring and standing next to me, wondering where this was going long term. There are probably a million medical reasons that I could explain this habit, but the reality was that for me, these napkins just felt like they were getting stacked on my shoulders with every time she placed them. And the more that she did that, the more apparent it became that it was a frustration for me. At one point, my cousin stood by the door of our bedroom and said to me, "One day you're going to miss these napkins." And he was right then, and he's right now, because I miss the napkins. I miss the way that she would always place a wooden back scratch under her pillow for some reason. And I miss the halls and the cough drops that she had just so. But the reality is that for all the nostalgia and good feelings that these napkins remind me of, this memory is actually probably the most vivid example I have that I can point to and say, that's when I saw how small her world had become. And that's when I realized that where I was sitting right across from her in my twin-sized bed that I did not anticipate still sleeping in as a college student, that my world had become just as small. I became my grandmother's caretaker officially when I was 20 years old. And it was at that point that I realized that she was this awesome lady who had had an entire world who was dependent on her way before she was dependent on me. And so there's a slide that's going to come up, and this is my grandma, and that's my mom, and that's me as a baby. Obviously, the resemblance is uncanny. And so my grandmother came to America in the 1960s with her husband and her 6 children. Over the span of her life, she raised 6 kids into adulthood. She saw her husband pass away, and she became the matriarch to our family. And in 2003, when my mom died, she became my legal guardian. She was 75, I was 10, and it was the first time that I realized that my life was very much molding around the circumstances around me. And with that, I ended up realizing that my world had become kind of small and that there was a formula that I was applying to it. So it would be like this. There would be something that happened, or the cause, and then would be the thing that happened after, or the effect. And I would wrap that effect in responsibilities and expectations, in this unspoken promise that no matter what, I would not say out loud how much I did not want to be good at this. How, if given the choice, I would happily hand this over to someone else to deal with. And at 10 years old, that reality for me was grief. I remember the afternoon that my mom passed away. Everyone came to my apartment. And I went from person to person, making sure that everyone was fine. And if there were little kids just like me around, I made sure that they were entertained. Not once stopping long enough to ask myself how I was feeling or what I was processing in that moment. Right before everyone walked into my apartment, I was hiding in the bathroom, sitting on the toilet seat, essentially pushing all my feelings back and getting myself to the point where I could go out there and serve someone else. And it was in that moment that I realized that instead of being asked questions about what I was feeling, because not only was I not asking myself, no one else was asking me, I was getting patted on the head for it. I was being told that I was so mature for my age. And those words became the thing that I ended up using as a guide in my life, and I ended up striving for that. I wore it as my badge of honor, And the reality is that that ends up taking a lot more from you than it ever gives you. And that fake maturity takes the place of so many memories and so many lived experiences that I never got to have, that maybe I could have had if I'd loosened my fist long enough to have someone else take the reins. Like, for instance, Taco Bell. Amazing, right? I didn't have Taco Bell until 2 months ago when I told my boyfriend that I'd never had Taco Bell and he could not go another moment without making sure that I had a taco within a taco. Or Gushers. What an acquired taste of a candy. But how cool would it have been for me to know that when I was 12 instead of when I was 26? And there are all these moments and examples that I can give you of moments that I probably didn't live because I was being so responsible and so mature for my age. And it ended up really coming back to this one question that I've started asking myself over the last few years, which is how do you rewind your life to meet you where you are once you've lived so many steps ahead? And how do you get yourself back to that place? So for me, it started with making sure that I was finding someone who was validating these experiences, because no one else around me was. And for me, that was my therapist. Probably my longest relationship yet. We've been in this relationship for 6 years, once a week in meetings. And it was in there that I was able to say things that I've never been able to say out loud to anyone else. Like, for instance, my grandmother got sick and started going in and out of ICU during my senior year of college. But before that, it was still hard. And there were still moments that were happening that I had no one else to talk about with. I started seeing my therapist a month after my grandmother started going into the hospital. And when I was there, I would tell her about how hard it was to know that I was sharing a room with my grandmother, the commode was in the same room, and that every time she had to use the bathroom, I would put my headphones on because it was just too much to process. And then when she got sick and became a fall risk and she was wearing diapers, that I had to make sure to change her diaper before I went to class, and how tough that was for me. And it was the first place that I was actually heard and listened to and validated that these were things that were actually really hard and that they weren't supposed to be easy, and I wasn't supposed to get patted on the head for them constantly just because I was carrying it well. And when I had these moments and this realization and this extra validation, it ended up opening to the second part of how you answer that question of how do you rewind. And it's by finding people who get it without you having to explain the nuances. It's finding the relatability factor to your lived experiences, because that one person will make you feel less shame than you've probably felt in your whole life. And so for me, that was starting to ask the questions that I'd never been asked before, and starting in the place that I knew best, which was, hey, have you lost someone, and do you want to tell me about it? And that's how toodamnyoung.com was born. Too Damn Young is a resource in a community for young adults who have lost someone they love. And I basically just started asking people that question. And we've published hundreds of blog posts and essays that show how layered grief is and how diverse it is and how much community there's actually in that. 1 in 7 Americans will lose a parent or a sibling before the age of 20. There are 43.5 million caregivers in the US today. 10 million of those are millennials. I met my first person who had ever lost someone after I started Too Damn Young, 10 years after I had lost my mom. I met my first millennial caregiver 2 days ago. So obviously there's a disconnect happening in the fact that there are millions of us out there, and I'm just meeting people randomly because I happen to be in this work. And so where is that disconnect? Why are we not asking these questions? Why are we not making sure that someone who feels like they have napkins stacked on their shoulders, that feels like a boulder, doesn't feel like that and doesn't feel like they're alone? When my grandmother was in and out of ICU, it was the same ICU floor that my mom died in. And I became incredibly familiar with the place I'd already known. And every time I would talk to a doctor, I cannot tell you the amount of times they would ask me if I was pre-med. Because I knew words like aspiration and end-of-life directive and all these different key phrases that made them feel like, oh my gosh, you must be pre-med. I was a marketing major. I was like 3 months away from graduating with a business degree. I was the furthest thing from pre-med. But not once did they ever ask me if I was okay being a senior in college and caregiving for my grandmother. And when we don't allow this space to have these conversations, we're failing the people, and we're failing the people they're caring for and the families around them. And all it takes is having the guts to ask one question that looks beyond the really good facade that someone is putting on and the good way they're carrying something to make sure that you're asking them if they're actually okay. When I had my first breakup in my early 20s, I remember standing across from someone, and they were talking to me about this, and I was telling them this was probably the hardest thing I'd gone through. And they said to me, "How is that possible? When you've lost your mom, you've done all of this with your grandmother, she passed away, that there's so much life here. How is that possible?" And when my mom's death is the ruler of measuring everything that happens in my life up against, then where am I supposed to live my life and figure out how to be 20-something? And where am I supposed to rewind back to know what it actually is like to go through the things that I'm supposed to be going through at this point in my life? And for every time someone asks you or tells you that you're so mature for your age, at 10, I was not so mature for my age. I didn't know how to be a kid anymore. And when they tell me that I must be pre-med and that all these things must happen, the reality is I'm carrying it well because I have to. Because that's what survival looked like at that point. And all the different answers I have to how do you rewind your life, it's because I'm trying not to survive anymore. I'm trying to learn how to live. But you have to make sure you're starting these conversations. About 2 weeks ago, when I was prepping for this talk, I started crying to my boyfriend about how hard it was going to be to talk about things here that some of my friends who are watching have never heard of before. And it's because there's so much shame in the fact that I didn't feel good throwing out my grandmother's commode, or that I didn't enjoy the process of changing her diaper in the morning, that makes you feel like you have to hide it so far back that you forget it's there, and that you definitely don't want to bring it up to someone else. But when someone else stands here and has this conversation, it's the exact way that we stop having that silence, and that we start making sure that someone else isn't out there carrying this alone. So we all have the opportunity today to walk outside, whether you're a doctor or you just have a friend, to ask the one question that looks beyond what is just on the surface. Because yeah, I may have been carrying it well, but there was one moment where I was a senior in college, 5 minutes out from having to give a group presentation, and I got a phone call from the hospital that my grandmother had to be discharged and there was no one to sign for her. And my worlds came up against each other because I had to be in there 5 minutes ago and I had to be somewhere else half an hour ago. And I did the only thing I could possibly do in that moment, which was sit on the floor and cry. And I shouldn't have been in that position because there were systems around me that could have helped me not. So don't tell someone that they're so mature for their age. Let them learn how to be a kid and how to grow up at their own pace and how to figure out life, even if they've lived a lot of life before that. Because really, I can tell you, that's probably all they want. Thank you.